Hi, this is Andy. If you turn on the television, it doesn't take long before you see words like breaking news or hear someone say, these are unprecedented times, or I suppose AI will lead to the end of the world. There are no doubt challenges that are unique to our time, and that can make leading in today's environment difficult as we try to navigate it all. But here's something that I wonder. Could it be that every generation has felt like this, at least to some degree, that we've always faced some sort of trying times with, great uncertainty, maybe even tidal waves of change? In a sense, what I'm asking is this: are the basics of leading today radically different from, say, 37 years ago? Or are the fundamentals the same? And the reason I mentioned 37 years ago is the first edition of one of the most influential books on leadership ever first arrived on bookshelves 37 years ago. The Leadership Challenge by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner has influenced generations of leaders, helping inspire them to grow their ability to lead and deliver. Jim joined us back in episodes 62, 63, and 153 to share his insights on leadership. And I'm excited to have Jim back today to talk about the 7th edition of their book. In today's episode, Jim will talk about what's different about leadership today and really what's the same. He'll talk about what he and Barry learned about leading virtual and hybrid teams thanks to the lockdowns from a global pandemic. We'll talk about diversity and inclusion, but from the lens of what their data shows. And if you've had concerns about how to lead in a culture of divisiveness or across generations, or how to take the next step in your ability to lead, Jim has practical insights you're going to find helpful. I've cherished each visit with Jim and can't wait to share this one with you. Hey, but first, if you've been listening for a while, you know about our course, AI Made Simple. It's a practical guide to using AI in your everyday work. Reviews keep coming in about how people are finding it helpful. AI Made Simple shows you how to apply today's AI chatbots on day-to-day use cases for us as leaders of teams and projects. I update the course each week to keep up with all the changes that are going on. If you'd like to learn how to use these tools to accelerate your ability to lead and deliver, AI Made Simple is a great next step. Learn more and join us at ai.peopleandprojectspodcast.com. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Jim about the 7th edition of the Leadership Challenge. Jim, thanks for joining us again on the People and Projects podcast.
You are most welcome, Andy, and thanks for that gracious introduction.
Yeah, it's all true. Most people listening to us will have heard of the book, The Leadership Challenge, just because it's been such a difference maker over the generations. But it's a classic now. I'm guessing many people don't know how it got started, though. So before we get into updates on the 7th edition, what's the backstory of how this all began?
Well, I appreciate your asking that question because this has been on my mind given my own transition in my career. And I'm talking a lot about how we all got started to a number of people because they're curious. And I'll tell you a story. I was unpacking my boxes in my new office at Santa Clara University. And I'm busily putting things in the right place in the drawers and the bookshelves. And I hear a knock on my door. And I turn around and there's this very tall guy standing in the door frame. And he says, "You're in my office." I was very shocked for that. Oh, new guy on the campus and I'm in the wrong place already. And he laughed and he said, "No, you're in your right office. It used to be my office, but I know the dean now made it your office. Welcome to Santa Clara University. I'm Barry Posner, and I'd like to tell you if there's any questions you have about the campus, you'd like to have lunch at the faculty club, meet people on the staff and faculty in the business school. Let me know. I'm your guy." And I took him up on that. Yeah. And we started to do walks around campus, meeting people. He did work in the Executive Development Center, which I was directing. And we became friends and explored our common interests. And one of those happened to be shared values. And Barry and I worked with Warren Schmidt on a paper called Shared Values Make a Difference, which was really the first writing we did together. And as we explored our common interests, it became clear that we were both interested in leadership. And we were thinking about a way to research it. What could we do together to look into this and expand our research on shared values? And we came up with an idea, Andy. The idea was to ask people who are participating in executive development programs at Santa Clara University if they'd tell us a story about their personal best leadership experience. And in February of 1983, we did a seminar with Tom Peters. Tom Peters was, February '84. We did a seminar with Tom, and we used that technique in that seminar, and we asked people to break into small groups, share their stories of personal best leadership experiences, and we posted their group responses, summaries, as we all do in our small group discussions and seminars and workshops. And they summarized their findings from the stories they heard in their small groups. And as Barry and I did a gallery walk with the participants, we noticed that there were common themes that came out of those conversations. And that was our first aha moment. We saw that there were some common themes among people from various backgrounds, different levels in organizations, men and women who were sharing their personal best stories. So we decided to take that the next step further, and we continued to use it in our seminars in executive excellence at Santa Clara. We ended up doing some deeper research using an assessment we now call the Leadership Practices Inventory to test some assumptions we made about what the behaviors were, literally from 3x5 cards that we used to put into piles. We didn't have a computer to do the analysis at that moment. And that became the origin, and a couple years or so later, we signed a contract with Josie Bass to publish a book that we were writing, which, by the way, wasn't titled The Leadership Challenge initially. This is a little known fact.
Yeah.
The contract actually says the end of management, the beginning of leadership. That was the title of the book. The end of management, the beginning of leadership. We signed that contract later as we were working with the marketing people, and they said, ending management doesn't really sound like a great seller to us. We need to rethink the title, which we did. And the subtitle of the book was, how to get extraordinary things done in organizations. And so we stayed with that theme, and then the Leadership Challenge, after many conversations back and forth, the title grew from that. And the main reason for that was that in every single case, challenge was what drove people to kind of motivated people to do their best. There was some challenge they were facing, and they really had to draw out of themselves their very best in order to meet that challenge. So it became the Leadership Challenge and published in 1987.
Well, I guess management has survived since then, so
yes,
that's good.
And there's still a management department in Santa Clara.
Right.
Another reason why we didn't want to offend our colleagues.
But I've always resonated with that idea of the challenge because, like I mentioned in the intro, Jim, every generation, I think, has probably felt like their challenges were unique because they were challenges, right? And they're not wrong. But when you look at the data now compared to when you first started, I'm interested in what has changed and what has stayed essentially the same.
I'm glad you started with this question because you reminded me when you were doing your intro to our conversation about my grandmother. I remember having conversation with people many years ago about this very topic because during the 4 decades now, going on 5 decades, Barry and I have worked together. We have always had different kinds of challenges, recessions, more than one. The pandemic being the most recent challenge that we've faced, but there have been many, many others in our space. There were no desktop computers when Barry and I started our work together. Now, we're talking through one. So there have been many, many challenges, many innovations, many changes over the years. But I always thought about my grandmother. My grandmother was born in the late 1800s. She immigrated on a boat by herself at 16 years old from Denmark to the United States, made her way across in a train from New York trains and buses from New York to Audubon, Iowa, where her sister, who had immigrated before her, lived. And she saw 2 world wars. She lived through, there was no rocket to the moon at the time. She lived through the launch of the space race. There were no airplanes when she began work, or no commercial aircraft when she began what she did.
Yeah.
And lived through her life through depressions and recessions and world wars. And those people back then must have felt those as challenges to their life, some more egregious than what we face
Sure.
today.
Hmm.
And so I think we have to remind ourselves that there's a difference between context and content.
Mm.
What leaders do, the behaviors they exhibit, have remained relatively stable over all this time, whereas contexts have changed dramatically. And I think we often confuse context because the context is different, the behavior has to be different. Not really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When my dad was trying to lead as an executive during his era, post World War II, the behaviors that he tried to exemplify, I got to see up close, were very similar to what we talk about today.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. That it doesn't matter when or what the context was, honesty still mattered. Right? Forward looking still mattered. Competence still mattered. Like those things, the content, if I understand your terminologies, mattered.
It's still important to treat people with dignity and respect. Right. It's still important to recognize people for their contributions. All those things have remained relatively stable. And we can say this with confidence, Andy, because as you know, our work is evidence-based. Yeah. We measure things using our leadership practices inventory, 30 items, 6 behaviors for each of the five practices. We use what we call positive work attitudes to measure engagement. We look at the relationship between when people put these behaviors into practice, do they get good results? And we find that despite age, educational level, gender, functional area, hierarchy, industry classification, length of time people have been in their job, etc., that when you engage in the 5 practices of exemplary leadership, and more frequently as a leader, the people you lead will be more engaged and more productive. And that was true when we first started doing this in the mid 80s, and is still true today.
And it even, like you said, it transcended all those things, even cultures, right? So it's not just a North America, so it's not just Santa Clara population, right? I mean, you've done this around the world.
Yeah, around the world, every continent except Antarctica. So
still working on that one.
Still working on it. Barry just got back from there. Maybe
that's right.
Maybe we'll those few outposts, scientific outposts. Maybe we'll do something there.
We just need one. Actually, from our previous calls offline, I think you're planning on going there too, right? Do you remember that?
Yeah, we're planning a trip for probably 2025.
Okay, all right.
My wife and I. Barry and his wife just went, so we want to go so we can share some war stories.
Absolutely. Maybe get a little data. So,
yeah, exactly.
Well, I'd have to think that something you wouldn't have imagined in the first 6 editions was a global pandemic that led to millions of people from around the world lead virtually. Yeah. I mean, virtual leadership had already started for a while, but I'm interested, what did your data and research reveal about how effective leaders adapted and led their teams through that challenging time?
Yeah, the pandemic was indeed a challenge that people had never seen in the workplace before. And it really because it affected everybody, we had a chance to take a peek at how people responded and reacted. And while, as in every line of work, our work in leadership development declined, fell off a cliff really at the very beginning of the pandemic, we were able gradually to get back to a place where we could continue to gather data. So the 7th edition of Leadership Challenge includes data gathered from 2019 through the book was published in 2023. So the last bit of data we could collect was really in late 2022. And so we were able to actually measure it and see, using our leadership practices inventory and using the same outcome measures, if the pattern was the same, and indeed it was. The pattern continued to be that when people modeled the way, inspired a shared vision, challenged the process, enabled others to act, and encouraged the heart more frequently, even when they were working virtually or in high stress situations, as in healthcare,
Right.
or in other first line responders work, that the pattern was still the same.
Yeah.
That when you did these more frequently, you got higher engagement and higher levels of performance. There was an initial reaction. Again, Erin Byrne McElroy was somebody we interviewed during that time. She worked in a small town outside of Chicago, although she commuted in Chicago frequently for her work. She was in a small plant in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And she, as she described, she was sitting on the couch, just kind of wondering what the heck she was going to do because she was out of work at the time. They weren't mobilized to go back to work, gradually going to do that virtually. But she was trying to think about what could I do during this time to make something happen, to help the people who were first responders. And that was her first inkling that she needed to personally do something. So I think the first thing that people did in order to address this challenge was what anyone does in a challenge. They embraced it. Mm-hmm. They said, there's a problem here, and I need to solve it. And that's exactly what we found in the initial personal best leadership experiences, that what ignited people doing their best work from their perspective was some kind of difficulty, some kind of adversity. So not everybody is an Erin Byrne McElroy, but every case we collected about personal bests and informed about what you can do in situations like this suggests that you got to step up. Yeah. You got to recognize that you can make a difference, that you can matter. You can use those skills and abilities to make extraordinary things happen. And so she got off that couch. She organized a small group of people to provide meals to first responders. And she enlisted people from local restaurants, local stores. The restaurants needed work. They needed some income. And she was able to get some donations from various people, get people in the community to volunteer, and was able to, at least in her community, do something with her own skills and abilities to be of help to others. And that's how people respond. They have to first recognize that you need to step up. You need to embrace the challenge. You need to enlist other people to help you because you can't do it alone. And that's how the 5 practices then are exhibited in these kind of situations.
Yeah, I love it. Someone told me years ago that their favorite definition of leadership, if you had to put it in 3 words, is figure it out. And there's an element of, right, but instead of contracting and being a victim, people like Erin was hey, figure it out. Like, what can we do here? Let's lean into it. And this idea of a challenge, you find out who you are in a challenge, right? Or you help develop who you'll become in the challenge.
Yeah. And I remember, another story from Sean McLaughlin during that time. People had to go virtual. And he was a senior executive, still is a senior executive in a large national media company. And Sean used to hold annual meetings to talk to people about the state of the business and to remind them of their shared values and the vision of the company. But when the pandemic hit, they had to go virtual. And so he started to have virtual meetings. And he told me an interesting aha that he had. He said, I was having weekly virtual meetings with everyone, unlike these annual meetings where everybody came, and out of necessity. And he said, I began to notice something. Some people were not engaged. They looked glazed over. They looked tired. They looked like they were struggling with something. And I wanted to reach out to them. I wasn't quite clear what I could do, but I decided to schedule one-on-one virtual meetings with those individuals. He said, I never used to do that. I started to do that because I noticed that people were struggling. And that's just another little small story about when you really pay attention, you see stuff you may not have seen before. He said, I didn't see this in these very large group meetings. Yeah. But when I was on this virtual team meeting, this smaller group of people, I could see that others were struggling. So I reached out to them. Now we call that practice enable others to act. You got to strengthen others and encourage the heart. You got to help them to through their own tough times by recognizing that they're struggling, that they need some support from you, they need some encouragement from you, or they just need somebody to listen to what's going on.
That's so
And
aligned. Yeah, yeah. That just so aligns with one of the biggest things I feel like I've taken away from your work over the years is how leadership is a relationship. It's not a transaction. It's not a hierarchy. It's a relationship. And I seem to recall the definition was among those who aspire to lead, because you have to aspire to lead, and those who choose to follow, because they might.
yeah,
Just because they report to you doesn't mean that they're choosing to follow. That has resonated with me so much. But trust is so vital. And I'm thinking in virtual and hybrid sort of situations, it's more difficult to build that trust. Like, so you gave some examples. Can you think of anything, any other stories perhaps, or ways that people can build and maintain trust, especially when you're not co-located?
yes. Let me just also provide a little bit of context for that statement. So, leadership is a relationship, and if and it's the quality of that relationship that makes a difference. And so one of the leaders assume often that because I'm in a position with a title called manager, that people will trust me automatically. But that's not the case. And that's why we say you're always aspiring to lead. You're never quite there.
Right.
You have to have that attitude, that I'm not as good as I could be, because other people are choosing to follow you on a daily basis. And if there are times we all don't quite practice what we preach, but including myself, my wife reminds me, but there people are watching our behavior every day and determining for ourselves whether this person is worthy of me continuing to follow them or not. And so we are constantly in need to build trust. And so here are a couple of questions. Do you trust people more whom you know or don't know?
Yeah, for sure. More. No. Yeah.
Yeah, so we trust people more whom we know. Now, there may be people you know very, very well you don't trust at all.
I
But
suppose. Yeah.
for most of us, the majority of us, we trust people more whom you know. And this is really brought home in data when you look at national polling around trust and credibility, for example. People are more likely to say they trust their local representative more than they trust Congress in general. Or they are more likely to trust their immediate manager than they are the CEO of the company. The lesson there is the more distant you are, the lower the trust.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And proximity, or in Sean's case, connecting with other people, one-on-one, really builds trust. So, one of the things we have to do is to, first of all, trust first. We have to show other people that we're willing to trust them first. Then they're more willing to trust us. You got to set the example, in other words. You've got to spend time and attention on building that trust. The language you use matters. The people that you associate with matters. When you're showing your concern for other people, as Sean did, matters. Actively listening to other people makes a difference. For example, people who master active listening are 40% higher in their performance than leaders who don't practice active listening.
That's interesting.
You got to share knowledge and information. All of those things help to build trust, but it really starts with the understanding that we trust people more whom we know than we don't know. And doing all those things that help people to get to know us as leaders, and then paying attention to their needs, hopes, dreams, and aspirations.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I appreciate you sharing it that way. I feel like another topic that maybe even more so than the sixth edition and before has been on the forefront of our culture is diversity and inclusion. And sometimes people view those primarily through a political or social lens, and I'm not implying that's wrong. I'm just more interested in what you and Barry found in the data regarding diversity and inclusion, and any practical insights that we could take away from that.
Yeah, diversity and inclusion is often thought about as a numbers issue.
Yeah.
We've got to make sure that our workforce represents the right number of people that we serve or the people who are in our communities.
So we get check marks.
Yeah, it's an important question. We do have to ask ourselves that. But let's assume for a moment you have the right mix of people. That doesn't mean that any of those people feel included and feel valued. The key word is feel. And that's really where we call it positive work attitudes, or the affective side needs to be measured. And those feelings of feeling included, feeling treated equitably, come from how leaders and teammates interact with each other and behave towards others. For example, on our leadership practices inventory, we ask a question, how frequently does this leader actively listen to diverse points of view? Getting at the question of diversity. And we are careful not to define diversity by demographics, but rather by a point of view. There's a diverse opinions.
Yeah.
And those leaders who are more frequently engaged in that behavior are considerably more effective, are more trusted than those leaders who are demonstrate that behavior less frequently. People feel greater pride, more willing to exert discretionary effort. They feel like their work is more meaningful when leaders simply actively listen to their point of view. And so we look at diversity and inclusion a little more from the behavioral standpoint. What are you doing? Are you paying attention to other people? Are you exploring their needs and their hopes, dreams, and aspirations? Are you treating them with dignity and respect? So that's how we look at it.
Because, like you said, you could have the demographic mix right and not listen, or they not feel like they belong or are included, and that doesn't help. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I feel like divisiveness has only grown certainly since you began writing the book, and maybe even since the 5th and 6th editions. So many people in leadership roles are just trying to figure out, how do I navigate when there's so much polarization? So any thoughts you have about leading in spite of being in a culture of divisiveness?
My first lesson around this whole notion of collaboration, of people working together, the opposite of divisiveness. Two stories very early on. One was from Don Bennett, the first amputee to climb Mount Rainier, and he did that on one leg and two crutches, 14,410 feet. And I asked him, as the first amputee to do this, what would you say was your most important leadership lesson that came from climbing that mountain? And he said, you can't do it alone. If it weren't for my wife and 7 kids, I wouldn't be alive today. If it weren't for my climbing team, I would have never made it to the top of that mountain. Bill Flanagan, an executive in a chip-making company, also kind of reinforced that lesson from Don when I asked, Barry and I asked Bill to tell us his personal best leadership experience for the very first time. He said, I can't do that. And I said, oh, but Bill, you're a senior executive. You've done something, obviously, that you think was at least good, not your best. And he said, oh, that's not the reason. It's because it wasn't my personal best. It was our personal best. It wasn't me. It was us. If we're going to have break through this culture of divisiveness, we have to stop playing the we-they game and start understanding that we are all in this together. that if we don't work collaboratively together, we won't get extraordinary things done. And that's what exemplary leaders do. They help people to see that each and every person has an important contribution to make, and each and every person uh, has something they need from somebody else, and that you can't do it alone. It goes back to leadership as a relationship, and learning to trust those that with whom you work, getting to know them, getting to know their values, and seeing how what common values emerge from an exploration of individual values. You need to, as a leader, facilitate relationships so that people uh, can work together more closely, develop cooperative goals, not competitive goals. You know, one of the worst ways in which organizations system wide really don't foster collaboration is they make people compete with each other for rank, for grades, rather than helping them to understand that we'll all do better individually when we work cooperatively together. So we need to create ways in which roles force people to collaborate with each other. We need to support norms of reciprocity. Uh, that is, if somebody does something good for you, you owe them,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
effect.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we need to structure projects so that they promote joint effort. I recall a leader in a bank card division of a national bank uh, where he was in charge of IT. And they had to make some major changes in IT. And that those changes were going to affect everybody. But what he did very early on in the job, he and his team, they went and introduced themselves to every other part of the company, talking about the changes that they were going to be going through. But instead of asking people to do something for them, they uh, they asked, "What can we do for you?
Mm-hmm.
What do you need from me to be successful?" Uh, and so that's the kind of approach we need to take, making sure that people understand we're there to help them as much as ask something from them.
Yeah, that's good. That's very practical. I find that when I see divisiveness sometimes close up, as opposed to on the news, often it's people caricaturing each other. You know what I'm saying? It's like
Yeah,
they're jumping to conclusions, assumptions about the person. Where if we treat it like what you're saying about a relationship, your comment earlier about actively listening, I feel like I get a lot of mileage out of. Tell me more. Like we don't end up having to, like Jim, even you and I, there's probably some things we don't agree on, but still we can listen to each other. And I think I feel like when, like to your point before about active listening, when someone feels heard, even if we don't agree on it, that goes a long way to not caricature. Any thoughts about that?
yeah. Our first response is often to win an argument, right?
Right, right, right.
Instead of try to understand where the other person is coming from.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's why active listening, helps leaders to be 40% more effective. Is because instead of saying, well, here's the right answer, or you're wrong, or let me tell you my side of the story, uh, we they help people to understand that first that I understand you. Do I hear you correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And adapt to that to to that what how that person is responding to them. Some people call it adaptive listening, not just active listening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in organizations where there's a lot of diversity, and increasingly that's the case,
Yeah.
the first approach a leader needs to take is to make sure that people get to know each other and spend time just on that topic. If it's a new team, that really ought to be the first thing on your agenda. I know we got to get down to work and make things happen, but uh, the first thing we need to do is make sure we all know each other a little bit better and know our strengths, know our weaknesses, know where what our hopes, dreams, and aspirations are, how we see our jobs, how each of us makes a contribution to the other. All of those kinds of things are important interventions for leaders to take, particularly when people are new, and continuously do provide people the opportunity for that in on a weekly basis, daily basis for that matter.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. I'm thinking it's not really divisiveness, but I'm thinking about generational divides, and I sometimes I'll hear people, complaining about they're the younger supervisor and they've got somebody older, or so they're older, and those millennials or those Gen Zs, and a lot of it I feel like risks stereotyping people, and it misses the whole thing about it's a relationship, not a category. But what are you seeing when it comes to leadership challenges across generations, and any advice for us there?
I have to admit, I remember feeling similarly when I was a young employee, and all those older bosses of mine said a very long time ago, and of course, then being in a position of managing other people who were older than I was, so like, God, I'm now in a role where I'm leading mom and dad. It's like, wow. Those are weird sensations, but understanding that it's really about showing dignity and respect, and respect and understanding that people have different. Going back to the context,
Right.
the contexts that people grow up in, and the challenges that they face in each of those can be different and unique. We all have challenges, but the ones that younger workers are facing today are very different. Two people working, if you're married, you've got to deal with, during the pandemic, both people were working at home, and they had to find workspace and find different ways while taking care of the kids who were also studying from home. All these kinds of things, that life experiences that people have affect them, and if we understand that, then we'll be more effective in working with those individuals. We have a question on the LBI: treats others with dignity and respect. And again, when you score higher on that behavior, you're more likely to have more engaged people working with you, and people who are higher performers. So similar to the conversation about diversity and inclusion, our data shows that the pattern of behaviors of exemplary leaders is not generationally specific. In other words, if I look at students in college, or I look at new employees just out of school entering the workplace, the leadership behaviors they need to demonstrate, or their managers, their peers, if they're working in a project with peers, the leadership behaviors they need to demonstrate more frequently are still the same. Again, no, the way we look at generations in our data is we look at by age. We don't say are you a millennial, are you a Gen Z, Gen X? And we look at age. We take the age categories and we look at whether that age group behavior is significantly different from boomers, let's say. Mm-hmm. And the answer is no. Mm-hmm. So what we know by measuring it is that the behaviors of leaders aren't different, and that we see the same pattern. We do a lot of work with college students, and we have a whole database of just student leaders. And if you look at the pattern of their behaviors compared to the pattern of people in the workforce who are of a different generation, the pattern is exactly the same. The more frequently you engage in these practices, the higher the levels of workplace engagement and performance. So you mentioned stereotyping. I think one of the dangers of looking at, even asking ourselves, how should I lead differently if I'm of one generation or another, can lead to generationalism. Not an easy word to say, but generationalism, another ism, and stereotyping and generalizing about a generation, which is in its own way a form of discrimination. Yeah. So when asked how leaders can approach connecting with team members of significant age differences, my response is always the same, which is listen. Leadership is a relationship, and listening is a fundamental to building a positive relationship. Uh, and so, understanding where people are coming from and being able to treat them and their experiences with dignity and respect, and showing respect for people at all ages, uh, is a way to begin that process. But you don't need to learn a different leadership language to lead people who are older or younger than you are.
That's great advice. You know, let's say someone listening to us, I want to get better as a leader. Just listening to you, Jim, inspires me. Certainly, I recommend they get a copy of the Leadership Challenge, because there's so much there. If if there was one piece of advice that if they would just do that, just one of those behaviors, or one thing that if they just did it more consistently would help them, what comes to mind, Jim?
One word: practice, or maybe three words: practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
Find ways in the flow of your work day where you can practice these behaviors. And if you can do it with a coach or a colleague who can give you some feedback on how you're doing, even better. I've often thought about leadership as a profession. If you're doing something 8 hours a day or more, like leading others, then it's a profession. And if you look at professionals, like athletes, they all have coaches. Sometimes if you're, in the NBA or any other, if you're at the highest level of professionalism, you've got multiple coaches, in fact. And coaches have coaches working with them. So why not do the same with leadership? Practice, practice, practice is my one answer to that question. Good. Find a way during your day where you can practice something. So let me give you a specific example. Let's say you want to practice active listening, which we've talked a lot before. Yeah. And you make that a goal in a meeting. And you say to everyone, today I want to practice active listening, and I'd like your help. At the end of the meeting, I'm going to ask all of you to give me some feedback on how I did. And I want your honest feedback. Yeah. Now, that takes a little risk on the part of any leader to do that. But imagine that you go through an entire meeting. At the end of the meeting, you stop and you say, okay, I said at the beginning of this meeting that I wanted to practice active listening. How did I do?
Yeah, that's good.
Hey, it doesn't take a lot of time to do that. You can do that. It's much the same as going to the gym and working out, You got an opportunity there. If you're giving a speech, have somebody sit down with somebody and have them give you feedback on how you did delivering that speech, so you can be better the next time. Find ways during the workday when you can utilize the resources you have and practice a behavior, something that you might have gotten feedback on you need to do differently, you need to do better. We wrote a book called Learning Leadership, which is about the 5 fundamentals of of learning to lead. And there are some guidelines in that book that go a little bit deeper into this. But the really major takeaway is you have to practice if you're going to be exemplary.
Yeah, that's good. That is one of the themes I remember from the book: deliberate practice. That
deliberate practice,
just like you said. I mean, deliberately, and whether you have to tell everybody that or somebody trusted in the meeting, go, hey, I'm trying not to talk too much in the meetings. So would you let me know afterwards, where did I go over that line and where did I do? But yeah, I think just simple things like that. We just don't see ourselves clearly, for sure. There's so many things I'd love to talk with you about, Jim, but just as we move to wrap it up, you're kind of wrapping up a season of your life, right? A different chapter, and all this traveling and speaking and writing you've done over the years. What does retirement look like for you?
Ken Blanchard, a good friend and someone probably most of our listeners know, is that use the term refirement, and I think that's where I'm at. Refiring in other ways, as you know, Andy, we had a grandchild, our first grandchild last November, and that has brought a lot of joy to our lives.
Yeah.
And so my wife and I are spending much more time as grandma and grandpa to Leo, and a better, we hope, son and a better dad and to our son and daughter.
Yeah, right.
So hopefully, I know we just next week we'll be spending about 5 days with Leo and his parents and doing our grandma grandpa duty, and it's really just a great joy, and we're going to fit as much of that into our lives the next few years, I'm sure, and as years go on, more and more time. So that really is important to us right now and high on our agenda, and because it's the first time I'm learning a lot about how to be better at that.
Yeah. Deliberate
and
practice.
I'm looking forward to deliberate practice. Exactly. Got to get that in there. And I'm looking forward to continuing to contribute through writing. We just finished the seventh edition of Leadership Challenge. Been out a year. We just finished another edition of the Student Leadership Challenge. We got 2 other books in the works. That'll take me at least through 2027. So, and mentally active.
Yeah.
And looking forward to traveling some more with my wife to places that we haven't explored around the world and locally. So that's how I'll be spending my time.
Well, so happy for you. So happy. For those listening, if you haven't yet read this book, or maybe you have, but it's just been a while, I recommend you get a copy of Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner's latest edition of the Leadership Challenge. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, hey, Jim, thank you for joining us again on the People and Projects podcast.
You're very welcome, Andy. Thank you very much for this opportunity.